Welcome back to Live and Local for Lunch. I'm Ellen Foley Kessler, and today we are joined by Deborah Goodrich Royce, author of the highly anticipated book, Finding Mrs. Ford. Deborah, thank you for joining us and being with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Surely. Before we begin, I should point out that you are a graduate of Lake Erie College and received an honorary doctorate of humane letters in 2008, and you have been extremely philanthropic to help Northeast Ohio, especially Lake Erie College, where you have endowed the Royce Hall for Fine Arts and Theater, and you've really made an impact restoring theaters across the country. So you're an accomplished actress. You've included several movie and television roles, including the lead role in All My Children as Susan Lucci's sister, Silver Kane. I think that mantra will follow you everywhere, Deborah.
Well, that wouldn't be such a bad thing.
Not at all.
Not at all. I went to Lake Erie College. I graduated in 1980 and came to New York, and really All My Children was my first break in the acting world, and it was a lot of fun to play her sister, and I played a particularly crazy character, so that was fun too.
That would be fun. So we want to thank you for joining us in Cleveland and ask you, how did the idea of Finding Mrs. Ford originate?
That's a great question. So after I left acting, I moved to Paris with my first husband and my two daughters, who were very small at the time. And really, in an unusual circumstance, I ended up being hired by a French film studio called Canal Plus to read English language books and screenplays and analyze those written materials for the French film studio, because they were seeking to invest in English language films, and they wanted native English speakers. So I have to credit the greater Cleveland area. Thank goodness I went to college. I had a degree. So I was able to transition from acting into, a little bit more, the beginning of a literary pursuit. So I worked in France as a reader. And then when my first husband and I moved back to the U.S., I was hired by Miramax Films as a story editor, which is like a book editor at a film company. And I spent kind of the middle of the 90s working there and just reading, and writing. I think my years at Miramax were really like writing school for me. So that's how I transitioned to writing.
And Miramax at that time was having one hit film after another. They were the film company in America, Miramax.
They were. It
absolutely.
was very stimulating, really exciting. I did work for Harvey Weinstein. I did not know anything about, that aspect of his life, and that's a very complicated thing now, because I certainly don't dispute anything or condone anything, but it just didn't happen to be my personal experience. So I learned a tremendous amount, and I feel very grateful for the opportunity, to have had the years I had there.
But you mentioned Paris. Did you ever think that you would really become an author, and did your time in Paris inspire you to write this book?
That's a great question. So at Lake Erie College, I did my academic term abroad in Paris. So I always had an attraction to Paris. My first husband grew up there. I think while I was reading for a living, I hadn't quite formulated a full vision of writing. I was writing a little bit on my own, and then in the year 2000, I wrote a screenplay, which I brought in a friend of mine to polish it up, and we got a grant for that from the Massachusetts Arts Council. But then I remarried, and life got very busy, and I kind of put it aside, and I continued with a couple of different writing groups and got some encouragement. In fact, we restored this theater in Stamford, Connecticut, and one of our advisory board members was Gene Wilder, who was just kind of the greatest actor ever.
Willy Wonka, Chocolate Factory.
He was amazing. But he became an early encourager of my writing. He read some, email correspondence that we had, and he said, "Are you a writer? You should be a writer." So I showed him that screenplay, and he was just very encouraging. So I think for me, when my kids grew up and left the house, it was a turning point for me and an inflection point, and it was a moment when I felt like, I jokingly say, not so jokingly, that I got the real estate in my brain back, and I just put serious time into writing. I thought, if I'm going to try this, I have to do it now.
Well, your book, we're not going to give anything away, deals with war, mystery, fear. Why these themes? Were there events in your life that inspired you to incorporate this in your book?
Well, one of the characters comes from the Middle East. He's a Chaldean man, and the Chaldeans are the Catholics from the north of Iraq near Mosul. And in Detroit, where I grew up, there is a large Chaldean population. So I came across these people, and I keep looping this back to Lake Erie College. I was studying Middle Eastern history there at the college, and I asked my professor about the Chaldeans, and she said, well, that's so interesting. How do you know about them? So probably I had a little thought for a long time about those people and who they were, and I like the mystery and suspense genre. I like juxtaposing different places. My book takes place in Watch Hill, Rhode Island, which is a beautiful resort community on the Atlantic Ocean. It takes place there in 2014, at that moment when ISIS is marching into Mosul. And it also takes place in Detroit in 1979. And the heroine, Susan Ford, went to college at Lake Erie College. So she's a student there at the time. She's actually about to start her senior year.
So you've really incorporated your past.
It all loops in, but I think really the book is an exploration of a woman's identity in two different times, in two different places. And the past catches up with her in 2014 in the person of this Iraqi man who's on his way to see her and is stopped on his way by the FBI, who then come to question her. So,
So we have to read this book because you do talk about joining together the past and the present, and so many women do have that. Is that the central focus of the book?
Well, it is a big theme. I tend to think that often as women, our lives can be episodic. I'm using a TV word. You know, we can have our college years, our career years. We may step away from career to have children and have those years. We may go back to another career. Not every woman's life is like that. Some women do everything all at once. I wasn't one of them.
But you have, I have to go back because you were saying you always had in the back of your mind, I want to be a writer. Then you have the good fortune of all my children and the wonderful fortune of even meeting Gene Wilder, who becomes kind of a mentor to say, let's write. Can you be a part-time writer, or do you really, to navigate it, or do you really have to, like you say, get the real estate back in your head and sit down and say, now I'm going to write?
That was how it happened for me. I know plenty of women who have raised their children and written at the same time. I wasn't able to do that, and maybe because I was busy with a lot of other projects, opening theaters and doing things like that. But I have a really good friend named Harriet Cole, and she has written 7 books. She was an editor at Ebony Magazine, Essence Magazine, and she and I were talking when I first started Finding Mrs. Ford, and she said, how many days a week are you writing? And I said, well, I'm writing 1 day a week. And she paused, looked me straight in the eye. She said, you are never going to finish your book writing 1 day a week. And she was absolutely right. And I listened to her, and I changed my ways and really put the time in.
Do you write longhand? Do you do it on the computer, or do you think it in your head and then get up and say, I've got to jot this idea down? How do you approach writing the book?
I write on the computer, but most writers will tell you, we're always thinking, so I write things down in the middle of the night. Mm-hmm. I keep a pad and a pen next to my bed, and if I have a thought in the middle of the night, I'll just jot it down in the dark. I can't always read it the next day, So I think I do like to write on a computer, and I have a room in our house. I live in Connecticut, and it's not my office. I do have an office. But we have this conservatory that looks out over a river, and it has a giant table in it, a round table, and I kind of spread everything out on that table, and that's where I sit and write.
Well, it sounds like it's inspirational. You know, being an actress and a story editor, does that influence your writing style? Because you're not, you know how you have